Welcome back to Bitcoin Season 2. I'm Charlie Spears with Blockspace Media. Bitcoin Season 2 is about ideas, new conversations on Bitcoin. It's the technical and cultural smashed together for an exciting era of new topics on the oldest blockchain. So everybody's talking about Bitcoin MEV right now. So we're going to talk about it. It's a more mature conversation on other blockchains like Ethereum, but it's comparatively immature in the Bitcoin ecosystem. We're going to talk with Walt J. Smith of Cyberfund about his recent write-up, The Specter of MEV on Bitcoin. We've also got Jullian Duran of Marathon, who is head of product, as the company makes very interesting moves into Layer 2's sidechains by way of the Enduro platform, which has as a design goal, among others, MEV reduction. So I think these guys are pretty sharp and emblematic of what I consider to be Bitcoin Season 2. And they represent the first conversations about what I think is going to be a defining era for Bitcoin. So let me bring up on stage Walt and Jullian. Thank you so much for coming. I gave you a little intro, but Walt, tell me a bit about yourself and how you got here.
Hey, thanks a bunch, Charlie. Glad to be a first-time guest on Bitcoin Season 2. Big fan of what you guys are doing at Blockspace. Yeah, I think like a lot of people, kind of in the broader blockchain crypto space, was kind of attracted by Bitcoin's kind of sound money narrative, store of value narrative, which is very much a narrative, but also very real. And then I think I kind of drifted into other ecosystems over time. Worked as a trader for a while at Galaxy Digital, then on their ventures team. Eventually, I joined Cyberfund, which is a family office based out of Europe for some of the guys who set up P2P Validator. Also, were the first contributors to the Lido DAO in the Nail Foundation. So I work in the ventures team. We do a lot of interesting stuff, grants, leading deals, following onto deals, a bunch of fun stuff. But we're very research protocol focused, trying to really bring about DAOs is I think one of our core focuses. So make DAOs very real and staying true to my roots. I've always kind of stayed in Bitcoin despite Cyberfund's kind of Ethereum centered. I guess the focus on Ethereum at Cyberfund, I still kind of have stayed kind of locked on it. And I think a lot of these side chains came out, or roll-up ideas or opcode ideas came out last year, and were kind of being ignored by the market. And I kind of took an interest right around July of last year. And I started thinking about how is the MEV different here? And then I think when ordinals really took off, I saw some really great tweets from like Eric Wall about it, and just got totally nerd sniped because I think MEV is definitely the most interesting conversation in Ethereum and Cosmos, and really translates well to Bitcoin in terms of kind of understanding Bitcoin's new expressivity. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, for sure. And your piece, The Specter of MEV on Bitcoin, is kind of like, I think, one of the defining write-ups on it. So thanks so much. I really enjoyed kind of getting some previews for that. Jullian, welcome. Tell me a bit about yourself, how you got here, and what Marathon is doing.
Absolutely, yeah, and thanks a lot for having me, Charlie. Definitely love the what's to come at Bitcoin Season 2. So yeah, my background is very much all over the place. I have a background in U.S. politics and social impact work in Latin America, energy in China, fintech in China. Found my way into the blockchain sphere, broadly speaking, after basically reeling from Chinese COVID policies and trying to find like some new gig in fintech. Wound up in the Ethereum world, which I know is kind of strange to have a Bitcoiner who started off in a different network. But I think what attracted me to this world, generally speaking, was the possibility for financial primitives in emerging markets. So I'm originally from Latin America, and my reason for getting into fintech in the first place was just the ability to do new things with money, especially in parts of the world where there isn't that much money. So finding new things to do with money, it's pretty essential. And I think just any blockchain technology, broadly speaking, can change that quite a bit. Now my my experience in the non-Bitcoin world was a lot of fluff and a lot of hand waving. I was actually trying to build real products, but oftentimes when we bring them to the market, last startup that I had in that world was crypto savings accounts in Central Asia. And so I'm out here in Kazakhstan trying to sell this DeFi app to people, and I'm getting questions left and right. Well, is this Bitcoin? Does this have anything to do with Bitcoin? Where is Bitcoin involved? Bitcoin. And I get so annoyed at the question. I'm like, man, but like that is impossible on Bitcoin. Can you guys just like take this? But then after like the nth time of listening to that, I was like, well, okay, well, let me listen to the user. You know, why are people so keen on this? And these weren't like, you know, maxis telling me this. It was just, you know, everyday people, you know, knowledge economy workers, taxi drivers, etc., that just knew about Bitcoin, and to pitch them a blockchain solution that didn't involve Bitcoin was just, it was a non-starter. And so anyway, my role here at Marathon, as you mentioned, is leading product for Enduro, and we're basically trying to expand the set of use cases, extend the utility of Bitcoin, grow the ecosystem. And I've seen it on the ground. I've seen how there's a clamoring for Bitcoin from voices who don't hold any of it. They just want to get involved and they don't know how to. And it's our goal. It's incumbent on us to find a way to make it more palpable and I guess accessible. So that's my defining vision.
Yeah, and you've had some really good, you know, you seem to be the guy to be talking about Marathon's Enduro platform, and we'll talk a bit about that. But I kind of want to pull back because I decided, like, I was like, who are like two interesting people to have this conversation with? Walt, obviously, and Walt. I'm sort of high level here because you know I'm also new to really the MEV conversation. I started at a high level, and in my experience, until recently, and even still, like most people in the Bitcoin ecosystem have no idea what MEV is. They don't really pay attention to what happens on these other blockchains. Walt, what do you think like the average Bitcoiner's current understanding of MEV is compared to the average ETH user? So what would you say that?
I think you know, a lot of ETH users have gotten front run on a meme coin trade. So I think they have like a very, you know, hands-on understanding of what MEV is, in that, you know, you broadcast a transaction, maybe it lands in the mempool, but maybe it doesn't. Maybe you send it to like a private RPC or private builder or something, but it doesn't execute right away. And even if it executes, the block isn't necessarily finalized right away. So that's basically kind of the main problem, is from the time you sign a transaction to when it actually lands, there's kind of this open value, this open expressiveness. And because it's a permissionless system where anyone can kind of act to fill your bid or fill your ask, or however you want to say it most generally, the system tends to kind of lean towards the most sophisticated, most savvy users, because they can extract the most value, and then they can bid you back, you know, the best value and bid everyone else. So that's kind of where the equilibrium sits. I think Ethereum people, you know, I'd say there's a couple buckets. I'd say like the hardcore researchers, I think really we're on the frontier of kind of building out the understanding of MEV, and we're probably the first ones to say, you know, if Bitcoin ever gets side chains, if it ever gets merge mine chains to take off, this is like a big risk for Bitcoin. And then I'd say there's another group of people that, you know, day trade and do interesting stuff, and I think they have a very good high level understanding of it, but they probably, you know, haven't like read a lot of the literature on it, which I think there's a lot of it in Ethereum and in some adjacent ecosystems. Compared to the average Bitcoiner, I'd say like 0, which is fine. I mean, I think ideally Bitcoin gets to the point where you don't have to understand what slippage to set a DEX trade. Otherwise, you're going to break the system, and everyone in the world has to do that. I think one of the great things about Bitcoin is you can just send a UTXO, send it to a mempool, and it doesn't matter if it's Marathon, doesn't matter if it's Antpool, it doesn't matter if it's some other miner. They'll just execute it. But I do think the core developers should probably have a better understanding of it, based off of, you know, the literature from other ecosystems, and then, you know, as they kind of consider which kind of opcodes to implement over the next, you know, decade, as they kind of consider which side chains to kind of campaign for, and how to make things like BIP 300 or BIP 301 someday work, possibly, or if the BitVM kind of develops and becomes more efficient. I think there's a lot of open questions in Bitcoin that it's really important that the miners, I think the core developers, and then probably people like yourself, Charlie, who are like not a core developer, formerly a miner, but are like very well educated and kind of, you know, you're not a shareholder on other people's behalf, but very much like a spokesperson, and have influence in the community. So I'd say like those 3 groups don't have a great understanding. I'd say right now, people like yourself have the best understanding. I think miners haven't really gotten it, from the ones I've talked to, and then the core developers. But I will say the last thing I'll say is I think miners are more willing to learn. The core developers kind of want to like reject the Ethereum research and create their own body of research. I think mostly for ideological reasons.
Yeah, I would say miners are very profit driven, very pragmatic, and when faced with unknown situations such as new things that people are doing, some might call it MEV, miners will, it seems to me like it's intuitive, like we'd be the first to learn. Now, like the average miner I speak to is not very technical. However, we've got Jullian here, and Jullian, like you are with one of the largest mining companies in the world, and which has taken a very forward approach to sidechain development and just this conversation. What's your thought about the current narrative and discussion around MEV on Bitcoin?
Yeah, I would say when we first started building Enduro, the goal was all right. Like, what are certain things that we should embed from the get go? Both things that the market needs, but maybe things that the market doesn't say they need now, but they'll need in the future. And so when we first started on that task, this was early parts of last year. MEV on Bitcoin wasn't even talked about. Most calls I'd get on to talk about this like layer 2 sidechain R&D effort that I was trying to lead, people would just kind of like laugh and like, like, all right, sure, good luck, man. I remember I got on a call with this venture team and like 8 partners come on board telling me how like ridiculous it is that we're even wasting a single ounce of shareholders' money to explore the topic. I mean, all of what you're saying is 100% true, and there was this reticence to even begin talking about it. But something for my world, having come from the non-Bitcoin side of the world, of the crypto world, is MEV is this is like the Polygon, Optimism, all these like new layer 2 side chains coming out in the Ethereum space. This is the thing that they would deal with, right? And like the single sequencer issue, and how do you decentralize that and make it more trustless? And by and large, nobody in that community had really sorted what they wanted to do there. And so one of the defining things, one of the earliest things I wanted to do with Enduro was, let's embed certain features into this platform and into the sidechains that we create that make this compelling not only to Bitcoiners, i.e., the Bitcoin native asset and all that stuff, but also compelling to outsiders, right? And maybe our approach to MEV resistance isn't going to be the most robust and the best out there. I think it's a pretty great one, but it's an attempt to try to fit into that, be understood by the wider market as being plugged into these different narratives. So I don't know. My view on it is, it's coming into vogue to talk about Bitcoin sidechains and Bitcoin layer 2s. As a result, MEV has become a bigger deal. But it's something we've been thinking about from the earlier parts of last year, though I will admit that generally speaking, miners want to keep things as simple as possible, in part due to the technical constraints, but also just due to the nature of the business. I mean, you're already dealing with so much complexity when it comes to negotiating energy rates and finding new mining sites and modular deployment and all these sort of topics that are mind-numbing and head spinning, that to on top of that start getting into, all right, well, how can we front run, or how can we play around with these other layer 2s and side chains that don't really have much activity? It's kind of, it's moot, it's useless. And so I don't know, my general take on MEV, I guess, and where it is right now in Bitcoin is it's in vogue to talk about, but it doesn't truly become a problem until that adoption really comes into play. And so in many ways, I spend most of my time on that adoption question, setting up the frameworks to make sure this is a robust system in the longer term. But I think the number one question we should be asking ourselves on top of any MEV is, all right, well, there's front running if there's transactions to front run, right? There's front running if there are transactions. So where do we get that transaction velocity? And all of these things are related. It's a chicken and egg problem. But I think we're only now beginning to talk about this because now there's that there's money to be made, right? Because there's that velocity or that interest.
Yeah, that's great. And I just kind of want to dive right into Walt's piece. Walt, Alexa got me for a second. I want to dive right into Walt's piece here. The Spectre of MEV on Bitcoin. It's on Cyberfund, cyber.fund. It's a great piece. And I kind of want to ask you, like, Walt, in your piece, you talk about key divergences from proof of stake MEV. Gasper meets Nakamoto. Can you talk a little bit about that and describe your thinking there when you say, by portraying Bitcoin alongside Ethereum and other proof of stake networks, key differences and the relative advantages and disadvantages become clear? Can you kind of flesh this out for me?
Yeah. No, I think that's a great question. That's one of the sections that I think I had some disagreements with, mostly from EF people at the Ethereum Foundation. I think my kind of general point with it was there's a lot of stuff in Ethereum that was included in the protocol after long debates that ended up not being necessary because they thought in the theoretical case this is what will happen, but in reality, in practice, there's natural frictions, there's transaction costs, there's a bunch of things that can kind of make in practice not meet the upper bound of theory. So I think one of the things that really stands out about Ethereum is there's been this kind of push for something called single slot finality, which is basically an accounting system internally where all the nodes in the network, you could call it miners in Bitcoin, but that's a different terminology in Ethereum, but let's just use the same terminology. All the miners in Ethereum sign off on a block before you progress to building the next block. And what this does is it makes it probabilistically very unlikely to have another reorg based off of the economic cost. So you wouldn't say it's really probabilistic cost. It's the right way to say it is there's a huge opportunity cost because you'll get slashed and you'll give up a ton of ETH if you attach to 2 blocks at the same time, or if you try and go back and reorg the chain. I think Cosmos, which runs on Tendermint, has the property of single slot finality today. But the Ethereum Foundation, right, when L2s kind of became popular and Arbitrum became a thing, worried that an L2 with more value, with more activity, with more economic kind of state would drive a reorg of the Ethereum network, and that would obviously lead to some really negative things for the applications. If you're running a system with an Oracle, let's say something like MakerDAO, and you had a multi-block reorg, you could actually bankrupt MakerDAO because you could censor, if you owned multiple blocks in a row, you could censor the debt from clearing, right? So this is a huge theoretical issue, right? In practice, if you talk to Robert Miller, if you talk to the really good MEV people who understand the theory because they helped write it, but are also building the infrastructure around that, clients like MEV Boost or MEV Geth before it, there hasn't been that many instances of reorgs. So I think this is another interesting point that I kind of talk about in the piece is there's the difference of kind of the rational world where everyone's driven by economic incentives, maybe their reputation is on the line as well, versus the Byzantine world where there's kind of arbitrary behavior where you can do anything you want. Bitcoin is a BFT system, so is Ethereum. They're both trying to be, but sometimes we butt against these rational assumptions, and they're kind of nicer. They're kind of more friendly to work with. They end up not being the right assumptions over the long haul for a variety of reasons. But I think when I talked about proof of stake versus proof of work, there's a couple bleeding considerations, such as the lack of single slot finality, and kind of the ability to potentially reorg multiple blocks, that in the case that Bitcoin gets a lot more expressive, you would expect more reorgs, which means confirmations, the number of blocks you need to settle or to have your block be built underneath. So if there's 10 blocks and then my transaction was included in the 10th block, I'd be like, okay, this is pretty secure. But if there's more and more reorgs, if there's more and more expressiveness, maybe it's 20 blocks, which makes Bitcoin a worse kind of asset for collateral. It makes it a worse asset for DeFi. It makes some of these more sophisticated applications harder to build. And all this comes down from this one property of accountable safety. Now, there's a huge trade-off with accountable safety, which is everyone on the network has to be known at once. So to have a voting system, you have to say we have this many nodes, they have this much balance, they have this many votes, they need to vote within this time period, right? So it's very complex. It's a very hard consensus mechanism to build. Bitcoin's really nice because it's very simple. It's just this heaviest chain sort of rule, right? But that also lets just a miner could come online in China and just build a block and then just disappear forever. So the kind of I always struggle to say this word, the kind of identity preservation where no one knows who you are and no one knows how you operate. And if you want to broadcast a transaction, you can just stick it right through, assuming you win a block or assuming you can win a block inside of a pool or something. It's really, really great. So I think this is a fundamental thing where, Bitcoin's going to consider different things, much like Ethereum did. And sometimes they're going to be like, oh, single slot finality, maybe we really need this, which Bitcoin can't really add it. But maybe there's a different mechanism, but right now, there's no research indicating Bitcoin can add it at all. Bitcoin's going to add stuff, and then down the line, it's going to be like, wow, this was a theoretical assumption that is, in practice, we never hit this theoretical assumption. So we kind of didn't need this feature. So if you talk to Robert, I was not arguing with Robert Miller at Flashbots, but him and I were DMing about it, and he was like, yeah, why do you think there's going to be more reorgs on Bitcoin? We don't even see them on Ethereum, because Ethereum doesn't have single slot finality yet, but it's something they've really pushed for because they're worried about Arbitrum, or they're worried about Eigenlayer or something, creating a lot of incentives for reorgs. So
yeah, so you managed to touch on like 8 questions that I had for you there, which is great.
You gotta come in.
But it does. It brings like, another part of, another section you have is you talk about us re-entering a Byzantine world. Just again for the normal, I know there's some ordinals degens who watch this. Can you explain what like a Byzantine versus rational actor would be? And then my follow-up question is, do you think Bitcoin, because it's less expressive, remains comparatively Byzantine just due to its nature and design?
Oh, that's interesting. I might not have a good response for the second one right off the bat, but I'll try and think about it while I talk. I'm not a theorist. I didn't go to MIT and get a PhD in distributed systems or something. So if anyone is watching and did do that, you spent a lot more time studying it than me, so you can't get angry. But kind of the back of the napkin math way of explaining this is a rational world is something where you model where all the participants are economically incentivized. Their welfare function is driven by money. Their reputation can be tied to that too, because in an iterated game, your reputation does kind of determine how much money you can make, right? In a Byzantine world, there's arbitrary behavior. So there's things, there's a couple of ways of saying this. You could say there's things out of the bounds of the protocol or just out of the protocol that can throw off the network incentives. So even if the incentive in like an iterated game is I go first, then Charlie, then Jullian, and we just go round and round and round, external value, that could be, a meta protocol like the Ordinals protocol. That could be a stable coin. That could be a protocol built on top of Ethereum or on Bitcoin. I think Eigenlayer is this like big restaking thing on Ethereum. You can get something similar on Bitcoin where, Bitcoin's not staked natively, but you could create slashing logic. You could create kind of proofs of, validity or proofs that someone should be slashed for their activity, right? And this kind of thing would drive, arbitrary behavior that Bitcoin can't really reason about. It's kind of outside the scope of what it can see. And by that I mean what the protocol can see, what an individual miner can see, but also just what the whole network can kind of deal with at a given block. So I think when Bitcoin's re-entering this world, it's kind of just this reminder that a lot of the assumptions that Bitcoin has kind of been built on and kind of what they've gone off of maybe will be removed. So I think if you talk to someone like Paul at Drive Chains, he's really pushed for like blind merge mining, which I think in 2012 the argument around this was largely based around hash rate centralization. I think that conversation is kind of over, but maybe it has some validity in the MEV context where you're like, this can drive less MEV. The barrier to entry to harvest cross-domain MEV would be much higher if the merge mining was blinded to what was actually happening on the sidechain. But if everyone could see it just automatically, right, maybe there's more of an incentive. So I think it's like kind of this reminder for the core developers, for the miners, for everyone thinking about it, that we're not in a rational world. There's the US government exists. There's Bitcoin futures markets. There's these meta protocols, silly ones like ordinals that could end up driving, hundreds of millions of dollars of volume, and more sophisticated ones like Babylon that are going to stake your Bitcoin and potentially drive reorgs. I don't think that'll happen in practice, but in terms of your second question, would you actually repeat it maybe for the audience and for me?
I kind of want to repeat it, but I actually want to throw that question to Jullian, which is, so Jullian, I mean, Walt talks about Bitcoin's fairly Byzantine, its current Byzantine model and state. Do you think in the face of heterogeneous assets and all these new things on Bitcoin, do you think Bitcoin has in some ways, because of its simplicity and just like MEV reduction built into the system? Or what are your thoughts on this topic?
I really think that at the end of the day, a world in which there are these heterogeneous assets, a lot of stakeholders in Bitcoin are going to find themselves without proper footing. And so they're going to hire people from these other ecosystems that have a better sense of how to manage these heterogeneous assets, have a better sense of MEV. when there's that incentive to profit off of it, I have a very strong faith that a lot of miners and a lot of stakeholders in Bitcoin are going to find ways in order to get a sense of what's going on. And if it's a Byzantine world now and there's a reason to be a rational economic actor, they'll move in the direction away from Byzantine and toward being rational economic actors. But I think we have some time. And I think like at the end of the day, there's a switching cost, right? Like there's going to be a time, like a startup time, so to speak, where people are still kind of getting their bearings. One thing I will say on this topic, just generally speaking, though, Chinese miners and Chinese pools, some of the most sophisticated teams out there, because they've been thinking about a lot of these sort of topics for quite some time. I remember at conference early part of last year, I wound up in Singapore at this Bitcoin Layer 2 event that was completely in Chinese. And to speak a little bit of it, but it's not like I understood everything. But from what I gathered, there were a lot of these conversations with top professors in China about side chains and roll-ups and all of that. And a lot of those conversations predate, which nowadays we're like, oh, well, now it's Bitcoin season 2. But in East Asia, I think, in many ways it predated it. So I think it's probably going to still be a Byzantine world, even in a world in which Enduro takes off and there's all these heterogeneous assets. It's going to take time for people to catch on. But I do think that there's already number one, there are some stakeholders in Bitcoin that are quite familiar and have been exploring this layer 2 space as early as 2016 and even beyond. And number two is that when there's an incentive to profit, you're going to have these other actors from other ecosystems coming in. And actually, we see this with Enduro, because the whole goal of it is a multi-sidechain platform, bring in other different ecosystems. And we're seeing a lot of big teams from other, the Solana worlds, the Ethereum worlds coming in and being interested in spotting an opportunity, in some ways seeing like, okay, Bitcoin, heterogeneous assets, MEV potential, they're not going to figure it out maybe for a few months, and I can profit on it in the interim. So I think we're going to head away from that Byzantine world in the event that these heterogeneous assets are actually adopted. Because again, it all comes down to you can't front run something that isn't existing in the first place. So in the world that we see that, I would expect a similar evolution as to what we see in other ecosystems.
Yeah, so that we've talked a bit about Walt, you brought up Paul Stork and BIP 300-301 and Drive Chain, which brings us to merge mining, which is an old idea. Now, in some ways, it feels new again, but it's back. It's back at the forefront of conversation. And Walt, you have a section in your piece on blind merge mining and perhaps some concerns or just some discussion on it. Could you talk a little bit about like how it might play a role in this MEV narrative on Bitcoin? So I kind of want to let you chat about that.
So I think, and maybe Jullian will correct me here, but I think from my understanding, there's a few implementations of merge mining. There's a few that are already live, like Roofstock. There's like the OG idea for it, which I think Satoshi actually came up with. And then I think there's like blind merge mining, which was kind of proposed in 2012 to deal with this fear over centralization, which if you look at like Bitcoin dev mailing lists, it's probably the repeated theme against merge mining. I think like the way to kind of think about this though is just like any sort of sidecar that has broad adoption above miners kind of raises the baseline level of sophistication. And the more activity and economic value kind of on the sidecar that you're merge mining, the more kind of political and economic influence that sidecar will have. So there's like a very similar thing in Ethereum with MEV Geth, where that really gave certain people a seat at the table in terms of core development in a way that some people were less fond of. Arguably, it was something super important, but I think other people are less in favor of it, and we don't need to get into the nuance of that. I guess for merge mining, I think one of the things to kind of think about with other sidechain schemes is a lot of this revenue is going to go to the L2. Miner revenue will cut back. There will maybe be ordinals fees. Maybe we'll have Rune fees. There's going to be a bunch of meta protocols on Bitcoin. That's pretty clear. But where this revenue is kind of pointed and how it's distributed, I think is like an essential question. Ideally, right, you would get a lot of expressiveness, a lot of, and I think Paul would agree with this. He says, I want to, with BIP 300 and BIP 301, we want to, have a Zcash side chain, which, I think that's kind of useless now, but I get what he's trying to say with it. A Zcash side chain, an EVM side chain, a Solana VM side chain, right? You want to do all these interesting things, but you want to keep the base level kind of requirements of running a miner very, very low, and you want to point this revenue to Bitcoin as much as possible. Now, I don't want to do too much pattern matching, and Jullian, maybe you'll have a really, interesting take on this from the mining angle, which I'd love to hear in a second. But I think with a lot of these side chains, they're kind of siphoning execution fees, congestion fees, and just general payments to kind of these, let's say it's a proof of stake or proof of governance, L2. Now the revenue is not really going back to miners. Now we're not really securing the network. So it's kind of a problem, but you also don't want to make it like too sophisticated. Running a Solana node is famously very hard. So let's say you have a merge mine Solana chain. Now it's gotten really, really hard, even harder than just running ASICs and finding, insanely low cost energy, which, people make full careers out of being like energy, energy gods, finding the cheap energy somewhere. So I think that's kind of the way to think about it. But the interesting thing with merge mining is it kind of breaks up the revenue. Potentially, if you have enough slots in the merge mine chain and you rotate it between a bunch of different miners, it breaks up the revenue, which could actually kind of like reduce some of the MEV issues and kind of smooth the fees to the miners, because Bitcoin block times are so long and they're so random. So let's say you have like a bunch of slots on this L2, on this merge mine chain, on this sidecar, and then you only have 1 or 2 Bitcoin blocks in this time period, right? So there's, some fees on the L1, but you've also broken up a lot of these fees for these other people. And maybe it's a business that they can run on the side. Obviously, the machines there are very different. So that kind of, is not ideal in that standpoint. But yeah, I think it's like the OG idea. I think it has a lot of validity. I think the real thing with merge mining is you have to get broad adoption really fast. And historically, miners, I think, were undereducated on this issue, or just kind of listen to the people who said hash rate centralization, even when that was already here. So that's kind of where I kind of land on it. But I think, it's a design space that potentially is the most promising in terms of, still allowing MEV, but kind of smoothing some of the issues around it. There will obviously be like application specific areas to address. But Jullian, I don't know if you want to come at this from the mining angle, I would love to hear it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, look, I think merge mining, it's something that most big miners have actually been involved in for a good amount of time. Rootstock, I think at the moment has like 60% of hash rate on it, and it's a no-brainer in many ways, especially if the chain is offering, if the transaction fees are Bitcoin denominated, then you might as well plug in. It's a simple API integration. And the hardware itself actually isn't different at all. I mean, the beautiful thing about merge mining is that you can mine multiple chains at once using the same hardware, no extra energy input. It's just basically like a setup cost and, of course, the hosting fee for the node itself. Now, my most of the sidecars, as you're calling them, that have come into existence, the nodes themselves are super, super small, both in part by design and sometimes not by design, but just by the lack of adoption. And so because of that, we haven't seen this issue of the sidechain node being so heavy and so insurmountable that could become some sort of barrier for Bitcoin miners to enter. But look, just, Solana VM is its own thing, obviously, but I think that the level of sophistication with setting up hardware on the mining front, especially with Marathon and with another other public miners and big pools, is such that I don't think it would be impossible, if there were market demand for a Solana VM, for them to set it up. And in many ways, I think they could probably be better suited to do so, insofar as like it's not all going to be co-located in one place or spread across like a particular few set of entities. Look, I'm not the expert on exactly where these Solana nodes sit, but my sense is that it's much less decentralized than Bitcoin. And just given that you have these massive miners and everywhere from the US, Russia, and maybe the Chinese ones are pushed a little bit underground or have moved elsewhere, but still, like you have some pretty sophisticated data center operations out there that it wouldn't be surprising to me that they would be able to run a Solana VM and maybe even run it better or find like efficiency gains that in the Solana world they haven't quite as much been able to find. But coming back to merge mining, I think, look, the blind merge mining approach and the drive chains approach is certainly one that we find compelling. I think ultimately anything that is going to force a consensus change on Bitcoin is going to be a tough sell, and it's going to require a lot of people to come together and coalesce, and that public opinion to come together. And so the way that we see it is, all right, let's start with what works. Let's start with what we can put out tomorrow, because a lot of the detractors of drive chains, oftentimes it has nothing to do with the incentive or what it does with MEV, or what sort of incentives it creates, the distorted incentives it creates for miners. Oftentimes it's, well, why do we need sidechains in the first place? No sidechain that has been created on Bitcoin has been all that active. Maybe if you look at TVL or speculative value, sure, but these aren't metrics that matter to Bitcoiners. And so to me, the first test case, the first thing that we need to prove is that these sidecars are actually valuable, that Bitcoin is more than just that store of value, and that it can actually be a layer for a lot of DeFi and a lot of innovative financial use cases. And once we prove that, then all right, okay, let's backward solve, or maybe this whole like Enduro thing, or these merge mine side chains without the blind part of things. Maybe they worked and they showed that there's that pent up demand. Now let's see how we can smooth over the MEV concerns after the fact. But look, I think another thing is that with merge mining without the blind side of it, if you have a federation involved, which is what we did with Enduro, there's a way there to add that MEV resistance, and to, no need to over-engineer the merge mining or try to find a way toward blind merge mining without a consensus change. There's no way to do that. But if you even try to undergo that exercise, we kind of started with the premise that, hey, let's just add in a collective, add in a federation here, consortium of entities, they'll sign periodic blocks, they'll guarantee that transaction reordering isn't happening for a subset of transactions that they are, creating or adding into the block template. And there you go. Like, at least that gives us a product that we can bring to market. And that's really been the focus from day one. It's just, let's just bring something to market. Let's just show that people are actually willing to use this stuff. Let's take the simplest design possible. Yes, there are trust assumptions. Yes, it's not permissionless, but at least it works. And then from that, let's see what other, all right, let's see how that changes the narrative on the drive chains conversation. Let's see how blind merge mining could be better from the MEV standpoint. But I don't know, at least from I know you guys had a conversation. I was supposed to join, but was too sick to join last week about MEV. I think at the end of the day, there is no panacea. You can have the most sophisticated solution, and MEV still happens. At the end of the day, if there's an incentive to front run, people are going to find mechanisms around it, and ultimately, the literature on it isn't completely conclusive. And insofar as that's the case, to me, it sounds like, all right, let's go with the federation design. Just go with the simplest thing possible. Get together entities that are legally bound not to, engage in transaction reordering, and kind of make the system stand on its own two legs, and let the R&D continue in parallel. And when it's, ready to be production ready, the solve all to MEV, then all right, let's implement it. But let's first get an ecosystem stood up.
It's interesting because it sounds a bit heretical to say that one of the best MEV mitigation mechanisms is to lean upon trusted institutions, but insofar as it does, it seems like that might actually work, and I think that's a kind of interesting idea. Yeah, what are your thoughts, Jullian?
I think that at the end of the day, it's so a few weeks ago we were chatting about creating an NFT marketplace. And anyway, I had some time on a Saturday, and so I designed this perfect system, and this is how it could work on our UTXO chain with DLC contract, all of this sort of stuff. And then I'm talking to the team about it, and everyone's like, well, why don't we just create a centralized marketplace? Man, this ecosystem doesn't even exist. Let's first get people interacting with these NFTs that we're creating, and maybe then if they trade them and they want to use them, we'll talk about the whole decentralization component then. And it comes back to this exact point, which is sometimes the simplest answer is staring right in front of you. There's no need to over-engineer it. And when it comes to, placing trust assumptions, we all know the issues with trust assumptions placed in centralized exchanges, right? Not your keys, not your crypto. I get it. But if you bring together, the goal of Enduro at least is bring together 15 or so entities, have them across different parts of the world, have them in Bitcoin, be Bitcoin forward, but maybe not in the same Bitcoin verticals, and hope that diversity and that differentiation moves them to a scenario where they're almost gridlocked on certain core issues. All right, no, let's engage in MEV. Well, you have, go convince the Chinese miner about that, join this system. And I'm not saying there's a Chinese miner in it, but just as a hypothetical. I think in our end, it felt the most simple. And it felt also something that would just work, right? Because the thing with MEV that I was concerned about from the get-go wasn't even the long-term like implications of, oh, what would this mean? Would this move us away from a Byzantine world? For me, it was, I don't want users of this sidechain on Bitcoin, like they're Bitcoin holders that are getting involved in DeFi maybe for the first time, to be front run. That is an awful user experience, and I don't want to recreate the same mistakes that happen in other ecosystems. And so, damn it, if we have to like recruit entities that just promise not to do so and put a contract behind them that has some penalty in the event that they do it, it works. At least it gets us past the first year.
That's really fascinating. I'm really enjoying this conversation here. Walt, before I transition to another thing, do you have any kind of more double taps or questions for Jullian on the Enduro platform merge mining? Where's your head at?
Yeah, I mean, not to make it contentious, I guess I kind of would have a challenge here that I think, the Byzantine versus rational thing is kind of what comes to mind when you describe that. I think off-chain stuff works until it doesn't. And I think, this is a little bit extremist or hyperbolic. But I think I know that I'm only doing that to kind of express the point. I think, imagine kind of like a world where like something like Slipstream, where you have this like private channel for non-standard UTXOs. Imagine that like generalized for anything. So let's like, people are going to laugh at this on Twitter, but imagine you have like an AMM on Bitcoin. Imagine you have like all these side chains on Bitcoin, and basically everything is trusted, and you're just using like private mempools, and it's like Marathon and Clean Spark and Ampool, and that's kind of the network, right? So dependency on these things will only increase because they provide a better UX, and it'll create kind of like fake security. But ultimately, like the revenue of the network and the political and economic power of the network will all kind of rest with a few entities. And then it'll be harder to change things at the core level without these guys. These guys will be able to kind of lobby for what they want. And they'll have, such a large percentage of the hash rate. They'll, for the same reason Ethereum doesn't want to have Coinbase stake all the ETH, because then, it's one phone call to turn off Ethereum. You want something like Lido. You want other validators in other countries as well. You want solo stakers. I think Bitcoin wants kind of like a rich distribution of hash rate, not just among its like big mining companies, but also like at-home miners and stuff. So I think by not letting them have access to the rich order flow and kind of the valuable blocks, you end up in a world where things become more rationally dependent, and then it's easier for governments to turn it off. It's easier for governments to apply pressure. It's easier for things like BlackRock, which have made their entire business model around kind of political lobbying and being these giant corporate shareholders and getting what they want at any sort of core development level done, whether it be an institution like the government or something like Ethereum. I think like that's the biggest risk actually for crypto, is kind of this corporate capture. And I think like any sort of rational thing actually accelerates it, because it creates dependencies where now if you're a solo staker, now if you're an at-home miner, you actually can't compete, because people are only sending their UTXOs or spending their UTXOs with Marathon or with CleanSpark. So I think like right now it's great and it's a great business model, but we want to make this on-chain. So like the way Ethereum has tried to do this is PBS. So like pushing block building outside of being a proposer. But I think in other ecosystems, there's different approaches. So I'm kind of curious if you have a takeaway on what that should look like.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, number of thoughts. I'd say number one is that at the end of the day, we're talking about Bitcoin. And there are a lot of large holders of Bitcoin that believe and will push very, very hard for this permissionless ethos to live on, right? And it doesn't matter what sidecar you want to create on Bitcoin. Any layer 2, any side chain needs to have liquidity. And so at the end of the day, Bitcoin holders, the vast majority of which came in at a time when, these exchanges and none of this stuff of MEV even existed in the first place, believe and want to keep that sort of world, that it in many ways hamstrings any potential corporate takeover, right? Like you need that Bitcoin liquidity to be in there in the first place. Otherwise, you're just going to be creating some altcoin sidechain. And then is it even a Bitcoin sidechain to begin with? Does it have any impact on Bitcoin? Probably not. So I would say I have a lot of faith in the Bitcoin ecosystem, and also just a recognition that Bitcoin itself isn't a technology, it's an exercise in social consensus, right? And so insofar as it's that, corporate takeovers are extremely difficult. Corporate takeovers are extremely difficult in the real world, right? Because you have governments and you have other corporates that are trying to fight with each other. in the world of Bitcoin, you have this massive decentralized army of whether it be whether they get operationalized via Twitter or X or otherwise, that will actively fight against those sort of efforts and fight against that bleak future where that you're describing. So I'm not as concerned about that. I've been in business a while long enough to know that the Bitcoin audience is a very different one. And I think, like, look, at the end of the day, if we're talking like non-Bitcoin ecosystems like ETH, like, sure, Coinbase isn't staking the majority of ETH, and so one phone call doesn't turn around. But I think 3 phone calls could probably turn off ETH in its totality. So I would say that, like, I mean, corporate takeovers, there's other ecosystems to be worried about. I wouldn't say Bitcoin is the one. Now, on the topic, I forgot. Yeah, there was another point that I wanted to mention that
I did like the spicy take though, Jullian. I really like that. I'm actually good
bit at the beginning. Just include it.
Yeah, we'll clip that. But I have this idea. Well, we'll clip out some of these. That'll be a good one. The hardcore Bitcoin crowd would love that.
Well, I'm
more
sure
than
they would.
3.
No, there was another point you made, Walt, that I really wanted to touch on, because I thought it was a really good one. Well, I guess the dependency on these systems, like, increasing. If, let's say, all right, I'm wrong and Bitcoin holders love the great UX and everybody just piles into it and creates this dependency, I think you're 100% right about that. And so that's another thing that we're embedding from the get-go. Well, 2 things. Number one is that the majority of fees that are driven in this network don't go to this federation. And I think that's the dangerousness of sidechains that have existed in the past that have just like a total proof of authority model and like have this like closed group of consortium entities earning all the fee revenue. We have a maximum of like 10, 20% going to this consortium, 80, 90 going to miners, right? And so the goal there, like a design principle from the get-go, was if you're signing on to be a collective member, if you're signing on to like help with like improving the MEV experience or reducing rather MEV on these side chains, you're not coming at it because you think this is going to be like a massively profitable endeavor and you're just going to own this entire network. It's actually supposed to be that, you're still you're here, you exist for the purpose of, again, advancing proof of work. So that's one element that we have. But the second element is just in terms of the future state of sidechains that get created, we're basically leaving it up to the community to create those. And so I think that there's an element of like, sure, Marathon, and maybe there's like a corporate genesis, but the longevity of this project is so much beyond us. I mean, I'll put it to you very bluntly, like, I'm leading product for this. I am not Mr. Expert when it comes to all things layer 2. And so at the end of the day, there are going to be bigger experts that come into the room, that build new side chains, that propose new developments and how this ecosystem evolves. And it actually behooves Marathon, both from not only from a product standpoint, but from a regulatory one, to not be the sole owner of this whole thing for the reasons actually you described. The more control the federation, the more control founding members have over the system, the worse it is for each of us individually. So it behooves us to let this like kind of stand on its own. And I think there are legal incentives that keep us from a total takeover. So anyway, I'll leave it at that.
Fascinating conversation. I'm loving this. I want to try to maybe wrap this up in 10 minutes. Jullian, the people watching, we got quite a few viewers right now. The people watching might not know that you're actually, it's morning where you're at, and you were on a plane all night, I assume. So
correct.
Yeah, I thank you so much for hopping in. It's evening in North America and morning over there on the other side of the world. This gets into like one of my big existential questions, and it's probably for Walt, I guess. This is a spicy question, but is there anything to learn from Ethereum except what doesn't work? It's a big question.
No, I mean, I think that's for sure savage. I mean, I think definitely yes. I think you can learn like what didn't work, as a good starting point where Bitcoin maybe won't take the same mistakes or can, leap forward a little bit quicker. I think one of the core developers was in like a Rollkit GitHub repo, which, that's like super specific, but a Celestia team focuses specifically on like a Rollkit development kit, so anyone can build a roll up really easily and deploy it to Celestia really easily. And in it, they were kind of debating some MEV stuff, and one of the Bitcoin core developers jumped in and was like, "Why don't we just like randomly order, and just use randomness?" And There's various like trade-offs with that and stuff, and we don't have to get into the specifics, but it doesn't work. It's not a good idea. And I think there's like a lot of established research where stuff that feels very counterintuitive of what you think would work in Ethereum ends up not working. I think Bitcoin is going to have staking, and I think it's going to play a significant role. I don't think the network will ever become proof of stake driven. I don't think people are going to swap out Nakamoto for something else, but I think you'll get like staking logic. So like people will be able to have bonds, and the bonds will be able to be proven. So if I do something off chain, I can prove that I executed it correctly. And off chain, it could still be on another blockchain, right? It could be on a Walt. But I think staking economics have a significant kind of threshold in terms of MEV, or like an importance in the MEV world. I think staking itself is a bit of a plutocracy because it's really rare to get slashed and it's really rare to lose that. Hash rate's a little bit easier to lose, right? Like we had the China ban, then we had the war with Russia. So within 2 years, we had 2 huge macro events where a lot of hash power just got turned off or like taken by the governments in Russia and China. That can happen all the time. Staking is a little bit different because it's internal to the system, so it's easier to port around. It arguably has more long-term alignment. I think a lot of people mine Bitcoin and don't know anything about it. They don't understand the 21 million market cap. I think there's some miners who think I remember I think it was like in the first halving, like one miner kept trying to mine blocks with the full Coinbase reward from like pre-halving. And so I think there's some alignment stuff where if you have skin in the game, if you're largely denominated in the network, all that stuff's going to happen on Bitcoin. So like big UTX holders, right? And if you can make a proposer commitment where you say, if I do X, I get slashed. If I do Y, you pay me a little bit of a fee, and you basically do something on someone's behalf, and it's crypto economically secured by slashing. That creates like a great place to build an MEV market. And that's kind of what Ethereum has done. So I think like Bitcoin is going to learn from this. Bitcoin's going to have staking. A lot of MEV is going to route through this, hopefully eventually, because it's one of the ways you can create kind of more secure on-chain markets. So I think it has a ton to learn. I think, the reorg stuff was kind of overhyped on Ethereum. I think it's potentially bigger on Bitcoin, just because the global distribution of hash rate is significantly larger. I think the payoffs could probably be greater, and there's less of a penalty. That remains to be seen, right? That's like a largely theoretical thing, but this could be driven just by like, merge mining a sidecar. So I think there's a ton to learn here. I just think it's very hard to map it and still have it be theoretical. So it's hard to know like what, seems feasibly possible, but then something has like some hidden transaction cost or some friction, or it's just like too hard to do, cross-domain MEV, which right now on Ethereum, there's very little cross-domain MEV between blockchains because they don't have the same assets, and that inventory is very hard to keep in because just switching between blockchains, even if it's both ETH, they're different versions of Ethereum. So it exists, in the case of like Binance to Uniswap, but it doesn't really exist in the Arbitrum to Ethereum case. But it's also because the sequencers aren't decentralized and they're not permissionless. On Bitcoin, presumably, this will happen sooner because the L2s are launching after we've had L2s for 5 years and 5 years of L2 research and R&D and product development. So I think there's a ton there. I love the inflammatory question though.
Yeah. So yeah, we can write all the papers we want, but it sounds like you're saying we need a MEV in the arena.
Yeah, that's pretty good.
Let's do it.
Yeah.
I feel like that's true.
Yeah, this is what Jullian's doing is you're leading this. I kind of want to like wrap up this conversation, close it on an hour. Jullian, closing thoughts just on the general discussion on MEV, on Bitcoin, and what do you hope the next few years looks like on Bitcoin?
I really hope there's a lot more learning from other ecosystems and taking in these top thinkers when it comes to MEV. The fact that like randomization isn't itself just a solution. Something that I see a lot is within the Bitcoin world is reinventing the wheel just for the purposes of, well, we're Bitcoin, and so we know this very well. And that's largely true. I think the Bitcoin developers are definitely the average quality of a Bitcoin developer is much higher than in other ecosystems. And I can say that as somebody who's hired a lot of developers, and I've seen that in practice. But I do think that we run a risk sometimes of being too isolationist. And so I really, one thing I want to do with Enduro, broadly speaking, is not to remain isolationist and take in these different ideas from other ecosystems and kind of embed them from the get-go. I also think that one beauty of this multi-sidechain ecosystem that we're creating is that it does give us like a test case, kind of like MEV in the arena, so to speak, and other things too. I mean, there's so many more problems and the user experience issues that Ethereum has tried a number of years now to solve, that we can use Enduro and sidechains on it as sort of like a test case to see how solutions could work on a chain linked to Bitcoin, on a chain that has merge mining and the miners are involved in the first place. And maybe there are ways to get creative with how that merge mining is incorporated. Like all of those ideas, very open to. And I think that's what I'm probably most excited by is the idea of creating this like sidechain network that learns from a number of different ecosystems. And one of the old concepts is like ETH is the test net, right? Like, well, okay, like if we actually believe that, let's Enduro's the staging, right? Like, and then let's push things to mainnet, right? Like after some extra testing. I would really hope that ends up being the case, because you don't just we can't just keep claiming that ETH is a test net and then not take any learnings from there. So hoping that the next few months of Enduro and the next few years also are ones that we incorporate these new learnings, have more conversations like this, and put things out into the wild and kind of like see what's theoretical versus what's actual. To your point, Walt, I love that point, right? Like we can't just stay in the theoretics. We have to think about, all right, like what will actually happen when people are using this, and not just what we think could. So that in a nutshell.
I appreciate that. Walt, closing thoughts.
I don't know if I have a closing hot take. I guess Paul was kind of right all along. So was Satoshi. Merge mining is kind of a superpower. I think it has a lot of potential interesting attributes. I'm very excited to see kind of the adoption Marathon's new stuff gets, and I think in 18 months we're not going to recognize Bitcoin at all from today. I think it's indistinguishable from even a year ago. And I think it'll just keep getting weirder and weirder and weirder. So I'm really excited for that.
You teed me up perfectly, Walt. That is kind of the whole thesis of Bitcoin Season 2. We're entering a new era. That lets me, I'm going to kind of refine what my little definition of Bitcoin Season 2, what it even is. But it's very clear that we're entering a time when Bitcoin is going to look really different in the conversation. So Walt, Jullian, thank you guys so much for joining. Jullian in particular, calling from halfway around the world.
Globally distributed.
Never too early or too late to talk Bitcoin. Right?
Yeah, this is a decentralized podcast, you could say.
It is. Look at that.
Yeah, so anyway, thank you so much. I look forward to talking to you guys again. Shout out Walt with Cyberfund. Go read his piece, Spectre of MEV on Bitcoin. And Jullian with Marathon Digital and the Enduro platform. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining me for the resurrection of Bitcoin Season 2. Make sure to go to blockspace.media, sign up for the newsletter coming out every Monday and Friday, and then subscribe to the YouTube channel, Blockspace Media. We will have a live stream on a weeknight and a video on demand during the weekday. So thank you so much for coming, and we'll catch you later.